The woman's voice drifted through the evening air like smoke from a dying campfire, soft and haunting. "Don't cry, little one." Jake Morrison's hand froze on his horse's reins, the familiar words cutting through him like winter wind. He'd heard those exact words before, whispered in lamplight, spoken with infinite tenderness, carved into his memory like brands on cattle hide. But Sarah was dead, had been for 3 years now. Jake dismounted slowly, his boots finding purchase on the rocky ground outside the abandoned homestead. The place had been empty for months, windows boarded, dreams scattered like tumbleweeds. Yet lamplight flickered inside, casting dancing shadows against weathered wood. And there was that voice again, humming now, the same lullaby Sarah used to sing to their daughter Emma before the fever took them both. He approached the window with the careful steps of a man who'd learned that hope could be deadlier than any gunslinger. Through a gap in the boards he saw her, a woman maybe 25, dark hair braided down her back, rocking something in her arms. The lamplight caught her profile, and Jake's breath caught in his throat like a fishhook. The resemblance was impossible. The gentle curve of her cheek, the way she tilted her head when she hummed, even the graceful movement of her hands. It was Sarah, as if she'd stepped through time itself. But when she turned slightly, Jake saw what she held, a baby maybe 6 months old, wrapped in a faded quilt. "Shan, my brave girl," the woman whispered, and the baby's crying softened. "Your papa will come for us soon." Jake's hand went instinctively to his gun, not from threat, but from the shock of recognition that ran deeper than blood. The baby turned her head toward the window, and in the flickering light, Jake saw eyes that mirrored his own, the same storm-gray color that had looked back at him from every mirror, the same eyes his Emma had inherited. The woman began singing again, that familiar lullaby, and Jake realized with growing certainty that this wasn't some cruel trick of grief. This was real. The baby was real. And somehow, impossibly, she was his. Jake's mind raced through possibilities like wild horses breaking from a corral. Another daughter, another woman who'd known his touch. He searched his memory, grasping for fragments of nights when whiskey had dulled the pain of loss, when loneliness had driven him to seek comfort in places he'd rather forget. The woman rose from her chair, still cradling the baby, and moved toward the window. In the fuller light, Jake could see she was beautiful but worn, like a prayer book handled by desperate hands. Her dress was mended in several places, her boots cracked with travel. She'd been running from something, or towards something. "I know you're out there," she said softly, not looking directly at the window but speaking to the darkness beyond. "I've been waiting for you, Jake Morrison." The sound of his name on her lips sent ice through his veins. He stepped back from the window, hand hovering over his colt. How did she know him? What did she want? "My name is Elena," she continued, swaying gently to keep the baby calm. "We met in Silverton 3 winters past. You probably don't remember, you were grieving, drinking away ghosts. But I remember everything." The memories came flooding back like a broken dam. Silverton, the mining town where he'd gone to forget, where whiskey had been cheaper than hope, a cantina, a woman with kind eyes who'd offered comfort without judgment. One night that had stretched into 3, filled with shared sorrow and the temporary warmth of human connection. "Her name is Grace," Elena said, lifting the baby higher. "She has your eyes, your stubborn chin. She's strong like her papa." Jake stepped into the light then, pushing open the door that hung crooked on rusted hinges. Elena turned to face him fully, and he saw tears tracking down her cheeks like silver streams in moonlight. "Why now?" he asked, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Why come looking for me?" "Because she needs her father," Elena replied simply. "And because there are men coming who want to take her from me. Men who think a half-breed baby is better off dead than free." The word hit Jake like a physical blow. Half-breed. He looked closer at Elena, seeing now the subtle features he'd missed in the lamplight, the bronze undertone to her skin, the slight upturn of her eyes. She was part Apache, he realized, which meant Grace was too, and in this territory, that made them both targets. Thunder rolled across the distant hills, and Jake knew it wasn't weather approaching, it was trouble, riding hard with spurs and hatred. The hoofbeats came with the dawn, a steady drum roll of destiny across the hard pan. Jake counted them from inside the homestead, 6 horses, maybe 7, moving with the purposeful rhythm of men who'd done this before. Elena clutched Grace closer, the baby sensing the tension and beginning to fuss. "Stay quiet," Jake whispered, checking his weapons for the 3rd time in an hour. His rifle was loaded, his Colt cleaned and ready, but bullets wouldn't stop what was really coming. The weight of judgment, the crush of a world that couldn't abide love crossing the lines. Men drew in sand and hearts. Through the gaps in the boarded windows, Jake watched them approach. 7 riders, dust-covered and grim, led by a man whose star-shaped badge caught the morning light like a blade. Sheriff Coleman from Broken Creek, a man Jake knew by reputation, hard as granite, with a particular hatred for anyone who didn't fit his narrow vision of righteous living. Morrison, Coleman's voice carried across the distance like the crack of a whip. "We know you're in there. Come out peaceful, and maybe we can settle this without bloodshed." Jake felt Elena's hand on his arm, her fingers trembling slightly. "They've been following us for 3 days, she whispered. "They think Grace is some kind of abomination. They want to take her to one of those schools or worse." The schools. Jake had heard the stories, places where they took mixed-blood children to civilize them, stripping away everything that made them who they were. Or they'd simply disappear, claimed by fever or accident, convenient solutions to inconvenient lives. "We know about the breed woman and her whelp," Coleman continued, his words dripping with contempt. "Territory's got laws about mixing blood, Morrison. You can't run from what you've done." Jake's jaw tightened. What he'd done was find love in the darkest hour of his grief, create life when he thought his world had ended forever. What he'd done was become a father again, to a child whose only crime was existing in a world too small for her beauty. "There's a back way out," Elena said, her voice barely audible. "Through the root cellar. I can take Grace and know." Jake's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "Running's over. This ends here." He could see Coleman's men spreading out, surrounding the homestead like wolves circling wounded prey. They had rifles, ropes, and the absolute certainty that comes with believing God approves of your hatred. "You got 1 minute, Morrison," Coleman shouted. "Then we come in shooting." Jake looked at Grace, sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware that men wanted to destroy her for the sin of being born. In her tiny face, he saw Sarah's gentleness, Emma's innocence, and his own determination to protect what mattered most. The minute was almost up, and Jake Morrison had made his choice. In the silence before the storm, Elena reached into her traveling bag and pulled out something wrapped in faded blue cloth. "I want you to have this," she said, unfolding the fabric to reveal a small wooden horse, carved with intricate detail. Jake's breath caught. He'd made that toy for Emma, spent hours whittling it during long winter evenings, while Sarah mended clothes by the fire. He'd carved tiny flowers into the horse's mane, the way Emma liked them, and painted its eyes with Sarah's own delicate brushstrokes. "I found it in Silverton," Elena explained, "in a shop where you'd sold it for drinking money. The man told me about the cowboy who'd wept when he handed it over, said it was all he had left of his little girl. I bought it, thinking someday I might find you and return it." Jake took the wooden horse with shaking hands, feeling the familiar grooves his knife had carved, the tiny imperfections that made it perfect. Emma had carried it everywhere, calling it Thunder, whispering secrets to its painted ears. When the fever took her, Sarah had placed it in the tiny grave, saying their daughter shouldn't be alone in the dark. "How?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The grave was disturbed by coyotes," Elena said gently. "I found it there in the dirt, like it was waiting to come home. I think Emma wanted Grace to have it." The weight of the toy in his hands felt like absolution, like a message from beyond the grave, that love didn't end with death, that family could be born again in the most unexpected ways. Grace stirred in Elena's arms, and Jake saw Emma's smile ghost across the baby's features. "Don't cry, little one," Elena whispered, the same words that had drawn Jake here, and he understood now that some echoes traveled across more than distance. Outside, Coleman was shouting final warnings, his men checking their weapons, but inside the homestead, time had stopped. Jake placed the wooden horse in Grace's tiny fingers, watching her grasp it with the instinctive strength of a child who belonged to two worlds, and would be stronger for it. "I failed them once," Jake said, his voice thick with old pain. "I won't fail you both." Elena's hand found his cheek, her touch warm as summer rain. "You didn't fail anyone. Sometimes love means letting go, sometimes it means holding on. Today we hold on." The first shot splintered the door frame, but Jake Morrison was no longer the broken man who'd drunk away his grief in Silverton cantinas. He was a father again, and fathers fought for their children. Jake stepped onto the porch with his hands visible but ready, the morning sun at his back like a promise. Coleman and his men had their rifles raised, but something in Jake's bearing made them hesitate, the quiet confidence of a man who'd found his purpose again. "Sheriff," Jake said, his voice carrying across the yard with steady authority, "I reckon you boys are lost. This is my property, and that's my family inside." Coleman spat in the dust. "Territory says different, says mixing bloods against God's plan." "Territory says a lot of things," Jake replied, "doesn't make them right." He let his hand drift toward his gun, not threatening, just making possibilities clear. "That baby in there, she's mine, her mother's under my protection, and any man who wants to change that situation is welcome to try." The standoff stretched like wire in winter, tight enough to snap, but Jake had learned something in his years of grief and wandering. Sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't steel, but truth spoken without fear. "Look at yourselves," he said, his words finding their mark in each man's conscience. 7 grown men, armed to the teeth, come to terrorize a woman and baby. What would your own daughters think of that? Your wives, your mothers who raised you to be better? One of Coleman's deputies lowered his rifle slightly, doubt creeping across his features like dawn shadows. Then another. Coleman's certainty began to crack. "She's Apache," Coleman insisted, but his voice had lost its thunder. "She's also the mother of my child," Jake replied. "And if being Apache makes her less worthy of protection, then maybe the problem isn't with her bloodline." Elena appeared in the doorway then, Grace in her arms, both of them beautiful in the morning light. The baby reached toward Jake with tiny fingers, and he took her, holding her high enough for all the men to see her storm gray eyes, her stubborn Morrison chin. "This is Grace Morrison," Jake announced, "my daughter, and any man who wants to harm her goes through me first." The silence stretched long enough for hearts to change. Finally the youngest deputy holstered his weapon completely. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "maybe we should head back. Lot of real criminals need catching." Coleman looked around at his men, seeing doubt where certainty had been. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his rifle. "This ain't over, Morrison." "Yes," Jake said with quiet finality, "it is." They watched the riders disappear into dust and distance, their thunder fading like a bad dream. Elena came to stand beside Jake, her hand finding his free one while Grace played with the wooden horse, babbling secrets to its painted ears. Years later, when Grace Morrison was grown and had children of her own, she would tell them about the day her father chose love over fear, family over prejudice. She would show them the wooden horse that had traveled through grief and back to joy, and she would remember the morning when 7 armed men rode away rather than face one cowboy, who had finally learned that some things were worth fighting for. The homestead still stood, weathered but strong, like the family that had claimed it. And sometimes when the wind was right, you could still hear echoes of that old lullaby, "Don't cry, little one, your papa is here."